All right, let's turn it all the way back to 2024, the year of elections worldwide. I think if you don't know, 2024 had a record number of elections, including one big one down south of the border. So what have we learned from the year of elections, and how can Canada and Canadians take stock? We'll now hear from Dr. Annika Silva-Leander of International IDEA and Thomas Cormier. Leading them in conversation is Katie Feenan. Katie is also one of our advisory committee members and is the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs at Hill & Knowlton in Ottawa. And throughout her 20-year career, Katie has had roles blending communications, politics, public policy, administration, and research. Thank you so much, and welcome Katie, Dr. Silva-Leander, and Thomas.
Can you hear me? Yes. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. Thank you for being here today. I'm delighted to be here and to have been a part of this fabulous event. So congratulations again to the team and to everyone who's been asking wonderful questions. So, because we want your questions again. So this morning, as you heard, we're going to be discussing a subject that I am particularly passionate about, and I'm excited to facilitate the conversation. We're going to talk about a range of topics, all with an eye to democracy internationally at a time of great geopolitical change. We're going to reflect, of course, on the year of elections, that super cycle we saw in 2024, and at the midpoint of 2025, where we've seen, of course, some additional elections that have been impacted by what we saw in 2024 as it relates to incumbency, as it relates to an increase in authoritarianism, some challenges to democracy, the continued decline of democracy. And we're going to talk about the impact of trends on long-standing democracies like Canada, and how countries like Canada can support democratic development and advance electoral integrity, as others, most notably the United States, walk away with the decrease in funding for USAID. Okay, so I would like to invite our first panelist, Annika Silva-Leander, to the stage. So Annika is the head of North America at International IDEA, an organization that Canada is a member state of. She is also the permanent observer to the United Nations for this organization. She's a leading voice in advancing democracy on the global scale. She's a seasoned expert, having previously led International IDEA's Global State of Democracy report. She spent a decade at the World Bank, focused on civic engagement and poverty reduction. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics and a wealth of international experience. She's a global citizen of the world who grew up in France, of Swedish, Chilean origin. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for crossing the border from Washington to Montreal.
Let's hope I can cross back.
Let's hope she can get back. So let's talk about the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. 30 years of International IDEAs. It's an intergovernmental organization of which I mentioned Canada is a member state. Can you give us a sense of your organization, because some in the room might not have heard of it previously, and what you do to advance democracy globally?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. Et je vais dire quelques mots en français, parce que j'étais vraiment fascinée par le caractère bilingue de la conférence. Je sais que ça fait partie de la culture canadienne, mais en venant de l'extérieur, de voir les gens changer entre le français et l'anglais, même dans la même phrase, ça a été fascinant de voir cette capacité. Donc je voulais juste contribuer quelques mots en français. Je ne vais pas faire le reste de la conversation en français, parce que j'ai vécu en France jusqu'à l'âge de 18 ans, avec des parents étrangers. Et donc mon vocabulaire français est resté au niveau d'adolescente, donc je n'ai pas un vocabulaire professionnel en français, mais je voulais juste dire quelques mots pour commencer. Thank you so much for inviting me. And International IDEA, the organization that I work for, and the acronym stands for Democracy for International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. It's an intergovernmental organization, and it's a small intergovernmental organization. We have 35 member states, and it's all democracies, both older and newer democracies from all parts of the world. And we have the mandate to strengthen democracy around the world. Canada is, as you say, a member state. Canada joined us as a member state 2 years after our founding in 1997, and we're very grateful for Canada's leadership and participation in the organization. We are headquartered in Sweden, but we have a global presence, so we have 25 offices around the world, both regional offices in all regions of the world, and then we have 20 country programs in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And we were created 30 years ago, and we're actually this year celebrating our 30th anniversary. We were created at the peak of the third wave of democratization. So when a lot of countries were transitioning to democracy for the first time, we were created to help them build their democracies, their democratic processes and institutions. And we're thinking a do tank, so we conduct research, policy-relevant research on democracy building. We collect good practices from around the world, and then we use that knowledge and analysis to provide capacity building and technical assistance to democratic reformers in newer democracies mainly, but increasingly also in established democracies. Then we also convene dialogues like you do here. We bring people together from different countries and from different sectors, from both policymakers, but also civil society, the media, and academia. And then we work across a number of different areas. So our name has elections in them. We focused initially a lot on elections because countries, as they were transitioning to democracy, had to the first step was to hold democratic elections, but now we focus on a number of additional focus areas in addition to elections, because democracy, as you know, is more than just elections. So we focus on inclusive participation and representation, technology and democracy, climate change and democracy, parliamentary strengthening, and a number of different issues. Just to stop before I end, one of the things that we do is that we assess the state of democracy around the world. So that's what I will talk about. We put out the Global State of Democracy report every year in time for International Democracy Day. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. And what I also wanted to mention, it's a little pitch for, we have a special report coming out in 2 weeks that looks specifically at the lessons from the super cycle election year. So.
Oh, very good to know. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about your organization's active monitoring of global democracy and its commitment to strengthening election and legitimacy. So what emerging trends, I mean, this little report may give us some insight in a couple of weeks, so maybe you can give us a little bit early insight, but what emerging global trends are presenting most significant challenges to democratic governance from your?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question, and there's so many challenges, so I will not talk about all of them. But maybe since we are celebrating 30 years of our existence, we have spent quite a bit of time this year sort of looking back on how the world looked 30 years ago and how it looks now, especially because we're finding ourselves in the midst of a fundamental transformation of the international world order. And so thinking back of what were the challenges 30 years ago and why we were created at that time. We were created to help new democracies build their democratic institutions and processes, and the challenges that we focused on at the time were very much around those challenges in new democracies, mainly global south, countries in the global south, developing countries that were building their processes and institutions from scratch, and the fragility that implied for many of them. But many of the assumptions that we had back then have proven not to hold true. I mean, one of the key assumptions was that democratization was a linear and predictable path, that once countries transitioned to democracy and held democratic elections, that they would gradually consolidate their systems to become consolidated democracies. And what we know is that that isn't true. certainly not for new democracies. It's not a linear and predictable path. Democratization is fraught with setbacks and reversals, but that also backsliding can affect mature democracies is something that we hadn't even fathomed or considered at the time. So much so that our statutes don't consider what we would do with member states that backslide democratically. So just because I wanted to mention 3 challenges that I think is affecting democracy globally, and we've spoken about many of them here in this conference for the past few days. But I think the context for all this is that many of the challenges that democracy is facing is facing democracies of all kinds all over the world, independently of whether they're new or mature and consolidated, and that is something fundamentally different from what we saw 30 years ago. Democracy cannot be taken for granted anywhere. 3 challenges that I wanted to highlight is, one is the decline in support for democratic norms globally, and that is linked on one hand to decline in the number of democracies, but also to decline in the quality of democracy within democracies. We see an increasing number of democracies that are backsliding, both newer and more fragile democracies, but also mature democracies. And that has led to a decline in support for democratic norms. And that is concerning for democracy itself because it erodes checks and balances, it normalizes authoritarian behavior, but it also has implications for world stability, for peace, for security, because we know that a more undemocratic world is a more unstable world, and it's a world that has more conflicts, also more prone to corruption, and that is less likely to deliver the sustainable development that the world needs now. So that's one, and I just wanted to mention that I represent IDEA at the UN General Assembly, and so the UN General Assembly is a mirror of the world. We have 193 countries in the world are represented there, and they all have a voice, and we have seen very clearly this decline in democratic norms at the UN General Assembly. We monitor how countries talk about democracy there. And in the 1990s, more than 90% of countries actually talked about democracy. And last year was the year in which fewer countries talked about it. During the past 5 decades that we've been monitoring this, less than half the countries in the world. So that's one challenge. 2 more very quickly. Rise of populism and polarization is a huge challenge for democracies all over the world. And we talk a lot about right-wing populism, but there is populism on the left as well in many parts of the world. Both types of populism are damaging for democracy. And we also see that in our analysis. The countries where populist parties come into government or voted into government tend to implement reforms that affect and undermine the quality of democracy quite consistently, both in terms of clamping down on free speech and civil liberties, but also weakening an independent judiciary and checks and balances and so on. And polarization is closely linked. Polarized societies provide fertile breeding ground for populist parties to take hold, but then these parties also further exacerbate divisions and polarization. So that is a key challenge. And the third one, and I'll stop there, is something that we have been talking about a lot, is disinformation and how that impacts the quality of democracy and trust in democracy, which is so central to democracy. Thanks.
Thank you, Annika, for setting the stage. I'm going to now invite our second panelist to join the conversation. And when we talk about 30 years of international IDEA, Tom Cormier has 30 years of experience working in this space. Over 30 countries or more, I think, Tom. So he is a true veteran in the field. He began his career, as I did, on Parliament Hill advising Canadian MPs. And that led to, international work and advising organizations like the National Democratic Institute and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Tom has dedicated his career to supporting democratic institutions, making them accountable worldwide. He's collaborated with major international bodies like the UN, the EU, USAID, and most recently served as president and CEO of the Parliamentary Centre, which many of you will know is Canada's really only organization that's focused on democracy building overseas. So come on and join us, Tom. Welcome to the stage, and thank you for being with us. So Tom, we're talking about 2024. I know you've been involved in monitoring and observing some of the recent, elections, but also, taking a view on what's going on democratic state in many countries. But I'm curious, from your vantage point, what are the biggest lessons that we learned in the 2024 global year of elections in relation to democratic resilience?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this event for having the commitment, the sustained commitment to get together and talk about the challenges and the opportunities of democracy. Obviously something near and dear to my heart. I think we all share that commitment. Look, it's been underscored, last year was a big year. It was the biggest year for elections ever. More than half the world's population in over 70 countries went to the polls, and there were some really, and so it provides a fertile ground to look at the challenges, because elections are that point where the rubber hits the road and you really get a chance to look at a number of different dynamics, and it gives an opportunity to study those. And I'm anxious to see the report coming out, because it was a really important year. It's been said, it was a bad year for incumbents, a bad year for traditional parties, and it seemed like a good year for populism and a good year for more division and polarization. But as was also mentioned, we had an election in the United States which ticked some of those boxes, but also is now, because of what has resulted, is having an impact on other countries. We saw it in Greenland, we saw it in Canada, we saw it in Australia. Keep your eyes peeled for Korea, Japan coming up in the next quarter. It will continue to reverberate as well, because of the profound and very rapid impact that new administration has brought. People talk about flooding the zone, and I would think it may qualify as a tsunami. In terms of what we've seen, not only, as you mentioned, the retreat of the United States from a very important leadership position on international development, particularly on democratic strengthening, that is going to have, it already is having reverberations. And so it also is challenging the United States' own democracy. And we see that the dismantling of whether it's inspectors general or those checks and balances that were the backbone of the United States system of democracy for years, that enabled them to take that leadership position, over almost 40 years ago, to start doing this work internationally. So I think last year was a very difficult year, but I think we may be in for changes. I do think, and we're going to get into this, it's high time Canada does more in the space, because it's been underscored, and I can't underscore it more. You've mentioned it, others. The challenges we are facing and we are talking about are happening everywhere. And that's really changed from the first time I landed in Kyiv, Ukraine in 1999 to start my international work. That was a time when, sort of Western democracies were there to talk about, how do you do this? We are the stable democracies. We can teach you a few things. Those days are long over. We need to learn from each other, because we're facing these issues in real time and nobody has all the solutions. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for Canada to engage, but I know we're going to talk about that a bit more.
We are, because it's a very important time as we wait for ministerial mandate letters to talk about these subjects. So, Annika, over to you. Let's talk about the specific trends we've observed in recent elections and how they've posed some great challenges to democratic institutions. Do you want to highlight some of those?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom, for everything that you've said, and I want to build on what you said. Last year's super cycle with more than 70 elections in at the national level, I should say, hundreds of elections, of course, if you take in regional and local elections around the world as well, gave us really a lot of good material to analyze important global trends. And I think what is important to remember is that of those 70+ national elections, a third of them actually took place in non-democratic contexts. And so looking at the context in which elections take place and the type of challenges and opportunities that present themselves in those different contexts, I think is important. So of the 74 elections, a quarter of them actually were held in outright autocratic regimes. So Russia, Iran, Belarus, Rwanda held elections last year, and obviously in those contexts there is no room for political competition or for the opposition or for free media. And elections that were held in those countries reinforced those grips on power of those repressive governments. But maybe the three types of scenarios that we saw in non-democratic contexts, there was also around a great number of elections that were held in hybrid contexts, so countries that are not outright autocratic, they have a little bit of room for political competition, but it's often shrinking, but they have a veneer of democracy. And elections were also held in those kind of places last year, in El Salvador, for example, which also enabled the president and his party, Bukele, to affirm his grip on power there. Second scenario in those non-democratic contexts, and then I'll get to how it affects what we saw in democracies. But there was another scenario where the elections in non-democratic contexts caused a lot of political instability. Venezuela is a case in point where the opposition actually won the elections. The government refused to concede. There was a lot of internal turmoil and protests to protest that, and also external pressure. Despite all of that, the Maduro regime maintained its grip on power and increased repression. And then the third scenario in non-democratic context, which is where elections paved the way or acted as catalysts for political change. Syria is one case. They held presidential and parliamentary elections, and a few months later, it wasn't because of the elections, but that dissatisfaction with governance in the country and many years of hardship because of the civil war led to political change there, and Bangladesh also in one case. But if we talk about some of the trends that we saw and challenges in particular, I hope we can talk about some of the opportunities and the positive cases as well, because there were some, but I'll talk about the challenges to start with. There were two things that I wanted to mention that we saw really impacting the elections last year in a way that we hadn't seen before. Disinformation and foreign interference, I think, is, we've talked about it a lot. Of course, it's not a phenomenon that appeared last year, but it played out quite critically, and also to affect the outcome of the elections in an unprecedented way that we hadn't seen before. I think the most telling example is Romania, which just a week ago held its final round of elections for the second time, because the first elections were annulled because of foreign interference by Russia. And that is a unique, unprecedented situation where you actually have a cancellation of elections in an EU country because of foreign interference. That's a level that we hadn't seen before. I think also when we're talking about disinformation, I think what happened last year that was also unprecedented is not only did we see disinformation spread on social platforms, but we also had the owner of a social platform engage Elon Musk, engage very forcefully, want to take over X and eliminate all fact-checking from the platform, which was then followed by all the other social media platforms that have removed, to a large extent, their fact-checking abilities, but also this individual engaging very explicitly and proactively in opining on elections in a number of different countries. That is something that I think is worth talking about, because it's completely unprecedented. I think here we talk about Romania, how foreign interference negatively affected the elections. Happy to talk about also countries like Taiwan, or Moldova, which had massive disinformation campaigns, also linked to foreign interference by foreign actors, China and Russia. But that managed to counteract those massive campaigns, and some of the lessons learned from that I'll happy to talk about. But just the second point, which we haven't talked about, and I think it's worth mentioning, also not a new phenomenon, but gender-based violence is something that we saw a lot in last year's super cycle election year. And I do think that it's important to raise this issue because it's also something that affects democracies old and new. And we saw it playing out in many different ways. In the US elections against Kamala Harris and other congressional candidates as well. In Mexico, both the president, who was subject to a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric, but also her opposition candidate, who was also harassed and bullied on social media and in person in many ways. So just wanted to bring that to the table, that is also a phenomenon that affects all kinds of democracies, old and new.
Tom, did you want to add
I
something?
did want to
Please,
jump
please.
in
No,
because
jump in.
you mentioned, and it's so important to underscore what happened in Romania. I'm reminded that the first foray of the Vice President of the United States to Europe raised that, but in a very different way than we're used to hearing from the United States in terms of saying, just because you don't like the results of an election, we're going to throw it out. And I think that's was a really important wake-up call for me to realize it's a very different environment we live in now. The U.S., along with like-minded countries, have always been there to stand together in solidarity and observe elections according to international norms and standards, to be able to speak with one voice when something outrageous happens, as it did, and a rerun is required. I'd also pick up on your point about the increasing gender-focused attacks on people who dare to come into these spaces. It's really hard in countries where politics is always rough and tumble. In some places, it's a matter of life and death, and it's really unfortunate that so many people are being driven from office because of the increasingly vile nature of these attacks. It's not about we don't want women in politics. It's direct email saying we know where your children go to school, and very pointed threats to remove people from the space where I think we benefit from those voices. So it's so important, and it was so great to hear France speaking yesterday to take a stand and to become an advocate of a worldwide problem that needs solutions. So.
Yeah, for sure. I want to shift to the positive. Are there positive, reflections on what we saw last year? I mean, personally, I spent a few years working in Georgia, and obviously that election was challenged, but we've seen the population stand, and like 160 days later, they're still on the street demanding a new election. So for me, obviously it is sad to see, US aid funding be taken essentially from that country, to see the soft power influence gone, but to see the population stand up and say, no, this is not the government we elected, is in some ways a positive. Are there other positives that we can reflect on? Annika, you mentioned that you'd like to bring some up, so please.
Yeah, no, I do think that it's important to mention that, well, of those 74 national elections that were held, 2/3 of them happen in democracies, and of those 2/3 accepted the election results without any contestation. I think it's interesting, though, that 1/3 had some contestation, even in democracies. Not violent contestation, but there were still issues. But I think the 2/3 there, the large majority of elections that occurred last year happened in context of high trust and where there was a peaceful transfer of power. So I think that's the first positive element that we need to remember. I think the other positive trend that we saw also, the large number of incumbent losses. 34% of the elections that happened last year involved losses for the incumbent government, and that shows that elections can, when they happen in contexts that allow for free, fair, and open competition, that they can provide a channel for political change and for people to express their opinions.
And the transfer of power is accepted, right?
Exactly. So a number of other examples of or where that happened that was very groundbreaking, for example, in Botswana, also a member state of IDEA, the elections led to the change of the governing party for the first time in 6 decades. Quite exceptional, very interesting and very hopeful. Other positives that happened also is even though there are not enough women leaders that were elected into power, there were some countries that had that saw their first women president elected ever. Mexico being one, North Macedonia being another one, and Namibia being another one. So those are some of the positives that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah. I'll talk about an election that didn't happen, and that was the one in Ukraine, which has been postponed because of the ongoing full-scale invasion. I had the opportunity and privilege to visit Ukraine again in last September and October to lead an evaluation of USAID's 10-year, over $100 million democracy support programming involving NDI, IRI, IFAS, really supporting civil society, election administration, political party development, but looking at and this support in the context, obviously it dates 10 years, so they went through COVID, and then the full-scale invasion, really testing Ukrainians' vitality to the maximum. I was fascinated by the impact of that support in terms of moving public opinion or checking public opinion. A lot of the work done involved focus group discussions, polling, to try to help political elites and civic elites and electoral managers to understand the mood of the public in an extremely difficult situation. Ukrainians have made a decision. They want to move to a Euro-Atlantic framework, and they want their leaders to behave better. And that was such a motivating factor my days in Ukraine dated, as I mentioned, from '99, when the situation was really, really difficult. It's changed, and it was really bittersweet to see so much positive change, and at the same time, the outrageous and unjustifiable attacks on a daily basis throughout the country. To me, it demonstrated the absolute essential need for democracies to come to the assistance of Ukraine with their institutions to continue that building. There's still more work to do, but there's a societal consensus that work is vital now. And I think there's an opportunity for Canada, for the UK, for the Scandinavians who are also there, and the Europeans supporting democracy to step in, because that very program we were evaluating really was yanked, and they've gone to a skeletal staff in Ukraine, NDI. I was speaking with them last week of 4 people now, 4 national staff. There's a tremendous opportunity for the world to step in and to shore up some of this support that is vitally needed. It is changing the dynamic, and it's helping political elites grapple and accept that they need to be led by the public's desires rather than their own games.
So, Tom, what you've identified, of course, is, and what I know Annika and Tom and I, and probably some of you in this audience have seen, is that many of these experts who have worked throughout their career advancing democracies are now found without work, right? The number of open to works on my LinkedIn is quite shocking. And in a space where countries like Ukraine they will need to have an election at some point, right? And some of the countries you mentioned that are moving towards, the change in political party and leadership shows that democracy is advancing in parts of the world. There is also a worrying decline that we're all observing. So I want to talk a little bit about Canada. And Tom, I know you came back to Canada to work in the democracy space. You know, we've seen two committee reports by the Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs, 2016 and 2019, that showed, you know, a real interest in supporting, you know, Canada's role in democratic development internationally. The minister's mandate letter from the previous administration pointed to, the minister, I should say, of Foreign Affairs pointed to, you know, a need to focus on democracy. But are we there? What do we need to do? You know, there's a tremendous opportunity. A lot of Canadians have worked in the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, all of these organizations. There's a tremendous amount of experience. You know, what do we need to say to the next administration to say this is an important area where Canada can lend a hand? And I have a specific question for you too.
Nope. Look, the evidence is there. It's interesting. The Canadian Parliament has consistently and repeatedly said, government, do more. Do more in this space. Share more. Be involved more. Not necessarily replicating what's been done, but harnessing the opportunity to engage in this space by drawing from what we have here in Canada, which is an extremely unique democracy. We have a very accessible democracy, largely owing to spending limits and also the nature of Canada, our multicultural heritage. We have a very diverse parliament. I mean, about, you know, a little under 20% of parliamentarians are born outside of this country. That doesn't happen other places. So we have a treasure trove of people who may have been born in an autocracy and somehow managed to come to a new country, get themselves involved in politics and get elected. That, to me, is gold that we need to harvest and to help share those stories, advance dialogue, but also reflect as well on our real-time challenge of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people, to ensure that they're involved in leading and participating in global discussions about this, because it's an extremely important challenge everywhere, and Canada has some successes. And there are dialogues and opportunities to be leaders in that regard. The challenge, though, there's, I think someone mentioned it, or Manon from the previous panel, government is risk averse, and that's understood. This can be done by making careful risk analysis and making sure that when engaging in this work, it is not done with partisan intent, but rather focused on systems and focused on principles and values. And that's something that Canadians can do very well. I was in Myanmar, and there was an incoming delegation, multi-party delegation, in the early days of that transition of Canadian MPs, along with party officials. And it was fascinating. They all spoke with one voice about the fundamentals of democracy, and it was a really good opportunity for those eager to learn about what makes democracy work, to see parties of different stripes collaborating together and repeating each other's points and underscoring the need for rules-based systems. So I really do hope there's an opportunity for Canada to lead. We're chairing the G7. There could be an opportunity there. I hope something has been in the works. I know those things take time. There's also opportunities, I think, in enhanced NATO commitments. NATO is absolutely a defense alliance, but it's an alliance of democracies. And I think an opportunity exists there to ensure some of that increased support, and it will materialize, is dedicated to ensuring that democracies are safeguarded and advanced, and it's, you know, we underscore that they are worth protecting. Yeah.
It's essential, right?
Absolutely. And I want to make one point too, and an ADM at Foreign Affairs sort of pointed it out to me, and at first I thought, I mean, it's interesting. Democracy support is not a big ticket item. It is very cheap. When you look at, if you compare it to food aid or large scale investments, to me that could be an opportunity, but to some it's a challenge because these are not big investments. They take more resources to administer. So to me, it's an opportunity for Canada to scale up a bit, to make sure that the investments are not so tiny that they are onerous to administer and to support. But this will not involve, 50% of an aid budget. This normally hovers around 1 or 2% of international aid. So it can really have a profound impact for very, very low investment.
Well, and the challenge is the spending gap is huge with USAID now, decreasing its, they were the largest funder of these programs internationally. So I think, there is this opportunity for like-minded countries like Canada, like some of your member states to step up and where that leadership is lacking, because we know that there are countries ready to fill the void, right? So, how do they do that? How do they work to promote and defend electoral integrity internationally from your vantage point at International IDEA?
First I wanted to thank Canada, because Canada is already a champion and a funder of democracy assistance, and Global Affairs Canada funds two of our important programs, both fighting foreign interference around the world and protecting elections. And Canada also helped us launch our new technology and democracy program 2 years ago that provided critical seed funding to launch this new area of work for us. So thanks to Canada for what it's already doing. Definitely the retreat of the US as a leader of the free world and in funding foreign aid is catastrophic. To put some numbers to this, US foreign aid used to be in the 60 to 70 billion per year as the largest funder of foreign aid around the world. Second funder in the world is the EU, but it was half the amount, around 30 to 35 billion euros per year. So nothing in comparison to the US. US has now, with the drastic cuts that they've done, slashed 85% of their foreign aid budget, which is massive. And that will have implications for the well-being of nations around the world, particularly the poorest and the most vulnerable and the most fragile ones. So certainly it will be very hard for countries and multilateral institutions to fill that gap. No country will be able to do that. But I think that, and what is also concerning is that there are a number of countries and donor countries that are under a lot of fiscal pressure and under pressure of increased defense spending, not least the EU, that are already in the process of cutting their aid budgets, not as drastically and as dramatically as the US did, but they are all cutting. So my plea would be for countries, including Canada, not to cut their aid budget, and if they have to, that they are very strategic about where they place the funds that remain. The risk that we see is that as countries are cutting, and as the US has cut programs across all sectors, including in the humanitarian field and global health, that those needs, immediate needs, are so pressing that that the countries that can help fill some of the gaps will focus on those priority areas and will deprioritize democracy assistance. So my plea would be that not to do that, because democracy assistance and support to good governance and human rights and anti-corruption efforts are absolutely critical enablers for ensuring that the aid that gets to other sectors such as health and education and humanitarian are well spent, and that, good governance is really the basis for sustainable development overall. So not to deprioritize democracy assistance. But then the second point is, that's just about the funding, and there is an important role to play of foreign aid, but there is also the value-based leadership that is important, and where we are seeing a void with the US retreating from being a leader in this space. And as you said, a number of countries can fill that void, and let's hope that it's democratic countries that fill that void. And Canada has an important role to play there as a healthy and vibrant democracy. So I would plea for Canada to step up those efforts in terms of its value-based leadership and make that role much more visible and vocal in many different ways. Democracy assistance funding is one, but also being a strong voice for democracy at the UN and in other multilateral spaces. Also partnerships are key. So not just to strengthen partnerships with European allies, but there are a number of democracies in the global south that are worth also strengthening partnerships with for a strong democratic alliance.
Yeah, and you obviously, Tom, in your previous role, spent quite a lot of time trying to strengthen those partnerships. I mean, I think about Armenia, Ukraine, but many other countries that you had worked with.
Absolutely. And look, it is a bit frustrating. I mean, I think Canadians want to be there. I think Abacus Data did some polling, it's about 2 years old now, but looking at how Canadians view international engagement, and there's a real positive association with engaging on advancing shared values and democracy support. So there is public support there. I get it. It can be a risky proposition. I would look at how it's, I worked for Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the UK. It started because of a private member's bill, an all-party consensus. They got together and said, this is what we want to do. And they passed a bill and said to government, implement this. And I think that's what's going to have to happen here, because time after time, politicians are saying, we want this done, or elected officials are. And then it somehow gets talked about in different ways, and all of the sort of the cons perhaps are maybe outweigh the pros, and it just doesn't happen. And I do think that that's what's needed. And I wanted to mention one point too that I haven't heard about in the last couple of days, and I think we need to do more of, is engaging political parties. We need to have them front and center in these conversations. They are the main actors in democracy. They are also an interesting beast because they, well regulated, they are different types of organizations, but they do need to be involved they need to be in this room, and they need to be involved in these discussions, because they play an absolutely important role in making sure that our democracy remains vibrant, but also that experience is shared with others.
And going back to your point in Myanmar, right? I mean, I have been overseas as well, and I mean, I've met people, Canadians overseas. They're across the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
We drop our partisanship when we go overseas because we understand that we're there to do a job, to support, to help, to listen. And so you're right. It's political parties. I mean, there are a number of people who are now out of work because of, the USAID funds. So there's a group, a community of Canadians who are here to come together and continue to advocate for that. So if you're in this room, make sure you're advocating. But also, we'd love to have some questions from the audience. So I know Maddie's down here waiting. Does anyone have any questions for either of our speakers? If not, I will keep going. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Danielson. I'm Deputy Mayor for Grey Highlands. There's a lot of conversation between this panel about the U.S.'s pullback and retreat, and we see through the news and media the big shift in their interest globally and who they're supporting and who they're not supporting. Is there fear of American retaliation to any governments that try to pick up this particular slack, where the current U.S. administration maybe isn't as pro-democracy as previous ones?
It's an interesting question. I don't see that. I certainly see it on the trade side. We've heard that mouthed by the President of the United States. I do think there are opportunities to engage without that kind of retaliation. I do think there's certainly a danger that other actors, like China or Russia, will step in as well to fill the void, particularly on humanitarian assistance. And let's remember, I mean, when you have an aid portfolio in a country, it really provides an opportunity to engage with the government at a very serious level. And oftentimes, because of that, of those other investments, you can have the uncomfortable discussions about democracy. And again, it takes a lot of diplomacy and a lot of, you have to really, as a practitioner in the field, always convince people you're not there for any kind of gain, but rather to share important values that underpin the sort of the democratic space. But I do think there are real dangers that other international assistance providers will use that aid to further their own economic interests, which I think will lead to more instability in the world. And so I think we cannot not step in this case.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
Maybe just to add what you said, I would say that retaliation to other countries for stepping in and filling the foreign aid gap, I don't think so. The rhetoric that we hear coming out of the U.S. administration is that they want to share the burden and that they feel that they have had a too large responsibility and that burden needs to be shared by others. So I don't think that retaliation on that is something that we need to be worried about, but retaliation on other fronts possible.
And going back to your point about collaboration, right? I don't think Canada can do this work alone. I mean, we'd love to see a well-funded entity that supports democracy building internationally based in Canada. I'm not going to say no to that, but I think it's going to take more than just us. And I know there are partnerships that we have with IGOs like International IDEA, but I mean, there's also space for bipartisan, tripartisan, collaboration.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Up all the way up there, Maddie? Maddie's been running, I'd love to see her step count for the past 2 days. She's been doing a great job running.
Thanks so much for this panel and the great ideas shared. Annika, your comment about not having even the systems in place to think about backsliding within the founding member states. But that, of course, has global implications, demonstration effects, patterns being picked up, authorities in countries feeling legitimated by patterns in Germany, America, other contexts. Could both you and Tom comment on a strain of public intellectual analysis that is saying, look, there's a great experiment going on in terms of liberal democracy, which is the changing faces of these societies, increasing diversity, dynamics in who belongs and who is recognized in these societies, and the challenges that's posing to liberal democracies today. It's been connected to some of the backsliding, some of the populism, and so that this is the great challenge. And some of the response to that within, I think, good faith public intellectual analysis is we need to de-emphasize identity, we need to get back to, individual group-based rights and start invisibilizing some of these dynamics again. I'm betraying my bias, I'll own up to them, but if I could put you on the spot to comment on some of that, including challenging even the premise of what I was saying or some of that scholarship, if you think I misrepresented it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, very good question and difficult question. Indeed, we see the backlash against liberal democracy and the rise of populist parties. I mean, it's the liberal dimensions of democracy that they tend to be critical of and to weaken and dismantle if they are voted into government. So it's different conceptions of democracy that are valued in the liberal dimension of democracy or conception of democracy. It's a much more broader understanding of democracy where elections is just electoral integrity and representation is one piece, but participation and diverse participation and protection of minority rights and their inclusion in the political process is a very important element, as well as the checks and balances and rule of law, etc. And in populist conceptions, it's a much more minimalistic conception of democracy that is valued, very focused on the electoral dimension, and that the electoral, especially when they win elections, that electoral mandates justifies clamping down on all those other liberal dimensions is certainly a trend that we've seen. I think that some of the backlash against, and we've seen it playing out very clearly in the US on DEI, or they call it a backlash on DEI, and on minority rights. I think that it's a narrative that has been pushed very much, because I do think that in a lot of liberal democracies, I mean, it's an important part of the democratic system to ensure that minority rights are protected. But I think that, and especially in the US elections, I think in the last ones, that narrative was blown out of proportion. It wasn't a central emphasis of the political debate, and somehow it was made to be a central focus by the narratives that were pushed, that this was the sole interest of some of the political views on the democratic side. So I think that pushing back against that rather than silencing those dimensions is important. I think actually International IDEA this year we launched a campaign called Democracy for All, where we're trying to also debunk some of these minority rights narratives and explaining why it is important for democracies to be inclusive, that it's not about being woke, it's about basic human dignity, and that independently of how small these groups are and what type of minorities they represent, whether it's ethnic or religious or sexual minorities or whatever it may be, that they have as many rights as and the same rights as others. And so for us, at least for IDEA, it's important of debunking those perceptions rather than silencing them or marginalizing them. That would be my viewpoint.
I think that's an interesting challenge that the world faces. I think it's going to be partly solved by regrouping with our friends, our like-minded friends who share these values, looking for ways of talking about it in different ways, because it is causing, I mean, again, that the leadership role the United States plays in the world, anything that happens there immediately ripples into other jurisdictions. I worked in this field for decades, and now when I'm in parliaments, they're asking, are you going to talk about gay rights? Are you going to talk, like, they're really worried that we're going there as a front to try to influence government policy. And I think we do need a conversation about, are we willing to put aside certain values in the pursuit of engagement, or do we have to find ways of having conversations about why inclusion matters and to demonstrate? As I mentioned, we have an inclusive polity here at all levels of government, and to have those, to draw upon those people that have lived experience about democratic representation, to be the ones that are out there front and center, engaging and being credible messengers for this, because I think the approach has to change, because that backlash was swift and severe to the, and we all read the article about the Enola Gay. The picture of the Enola Gay was removed from the Department of Defense website because it got scrubbed in a mass dump of removing certain words. So I think we have a challenge on our hands, but I think we have to figure out through dialogue with others, how do we continue along the path, but perhaps with different messengers and different ways of talking about it.
Okay, we're going to take one more question before we end for the day.
Thank you all for your comments today. Very much appreciate this. I've been frustrated over the years as well about how many Canadians have had to move to the United States to work in this space. And it is frustrating because on so many occasions we've worked very hard to try to develop something here in Canada. You've seen it in speeches from the throne, other areas. People talk about it almost as if we need to work in this space. It's mum and apple pie, but we can't get there. You've talked about the principles of democracy. I wonder whether we should talk about what the incentives are for Canada to get into the space. Be a little more forward. Why would a government and an opposition want to be involved in this space right now?
You want to go, Tom?
I'll take a go. I mean, look, there are many reasons why one engages internationally. And as I mentioned, this is a very unique type of work. It is development work, but it's also advancing foreign policy. It's advancing discussions about important values. But also, when I spoke, when I was running the Parliamentary Centre with parliamentary groups, whether it's the Canada-Africa Association or there are certain bilateral associations, they're seeking deeper engagements with counterparts in other countries. Absolutely, if Canada had a program assisting or accompanying that parliament in question it would make for a much richer discussion when parliamentarians go and sit down with their counterparts to talk about issues of concern in the bilateral relationship, but also in how is this parliament advancing on its goals to become a more open democratic space and arena for informed dialogue. There are tremendous opportunities. There are also other opportunities when governments feel that they are, if you're engaging in a respectful way, that they are joining a club of, and which could increase trade opportunities for the host country, but also for us. It's certainly, we have to be careful on how much we oversell this, but better relations between governments can have other positive impacts. When we were running for a seat on the UN, Canada, which Canada wasn't successful in doing in the Security Council, running around trying to get support in certain countries where perhaps investment was lacking. They chose, they make decisions based on a variety of factors, but that could also help in Canada's goals to be an international leader. So I think that the opportunities are many. I do think engaging politicians and political parties in this is essential, because I think that they can understand and nuance those discussions. But I think I want MPs that are more informed about Canada's place in the world when they're making decisions. And this type of engagement provides a really good opportunity to go beyond parliamentary diplomacy and actually get into talking about bilateral challenges and opportunities that can be advanced.
It's that soft power, right? Why was the National Endowment for Democracy formed? It was formed because the opportunity for soft power was there. And I think when Canada has stood up and, voiced it's been a long time. I mean, we have to remind ourselves, the Ottawa Treaty for Landmines was a long time ago, and we still reflect back on that with positive viewpoint. But, Canada hasn't done anything like that in a long time. So I think the opportunity is now. Better than any other time. Do you have any final thoughts on that one?
No, just to affirm what you said, Tom, and I think that making the case for why foreign aid is important is something that all countries right now have to justify. There is, in a number of countries, public opinion, especially in context of economic hardship, public opinion for foreign aid is not necessarily very positive. That a large part of the electorate in many countries thinks that the limited resources that countries have to be used domestically. And so that places a responsibility of us that work in the foreign aid sector to be able to make the argument much more clearly for countries' domestic constituencies. And beyond the argument that democracy and foreign aid is moral imperative, I think that argument only goes that far. I think that we need to work more on providing data and backup and evidence and case studies on why the instrumental value of foreign aid. And there are a number of arguments, not least on the security front. A more democratic world is more peaceful. Wars cost a lot of money. It's better to prevent the conflicts than to try to solve them once they have already started. And also on the economic aspect, the trade aspects, a more prosperous world gives more trading partners for Canada. So, but we need to be better at making those arguments. I'll be happy to supply you with data and arguments for that if you want to.
On that brilliant note, thank you to both of you for being here. And thank you to the Democratic Engagement Exchange for giving us the opportunity to broaden the lens and to talk about international, the international perspective, because I think it's important. Sometimes we like to focus on Canada alone. So, to be given these spaces is really important. So thank you very much to everyone. And thank you to both of you.